The first time in more than 40 years of broadcasting, we've persuaded a housewife megastar to come to the microphone and share every throbbing moment of her no-holds-barred autobiography. Here is the book the world has been waiting for, as Dame Edna Everage begins the first of 9 episodes of My Gorgeous Life. But first, a warning.
All the persons in this book exist and are called by their real names. Anyone objecting to this could find themselves involved in costly and interminable litigation.
It's such a gift without price to be nice even when you feel blue. 'Cause I really care, and I've come here to share my wonderful, wonderful niceness with you. I will never forget the morning Madge and I set off to Somerset House for a little investigative probe into my ancestral roots. Luckily, someone there recognised me from the telly, which cut a few corners. He was actually a tinted chappie, but beautifully groomed and probably spotless. I'd brought along my great-grandmother Beasley's birth certificate, which we'd found amongst my mother's effects the night we burnt her things. And after Dennis had sweetly taken us into the bowels of the building, on the top floor, a helpful lass fiddled around with her computer, and lo and behold, the whole Beasley family tree started flashing across her screen. "Are you sure you want to see this, Dame Edna?" she asked. "Of course I do," I exclaimed. "I happen to know my ancestors weren't saints, but whatever they got up to was the only way they knew of protesting against social injustices which prevailed across the board in pre-Thatcherite Britain as we know it." Frankly, this may not have been exactly what I said, but it is certainly what I think, and historians agree with me too. Modern research and carbon dating is proving that most so-called convicts sent to Australia in the old days were highly intelligent revolutionaries and intellectuals, rebelling against ghastly conditions like the plague, the Black Death, and bodyline bowling. "This is fascinating," said the girl. "Your namesake, Edna Beasley, was convicted for petty theft way back in 1770 and transported to Australia in a convict ship. To cut a long story short, my poor little ancestor was actually apprehended stealing a gladiolus flower from a Covent Garden florist. Probably, now I come to think of it, one of Audrey Hepburn's ancestors. I must phone Audrey and tell her. I doubt if she needs to be ex-directory anymore. I'm naturally into reincarnation. In fact, I would probably be the reincarnation of Mother Teresa, except that she's still alive. Shirley MacLaine, my old buddy, thinks I'm almost certainly the reincarnation of Boadicea, Mary Queen of Scots, Lady Macbeth, Florence Nightingale, Mrs. Beaton, and Ethel Merman. And who'd argue with Shirl on this particular subject? However, we are all, aren't we, to some extent, reincarnations of our ancestors, and that spunky little felonious forebear of mine certainly had a spooky influence on my life. Long before I ever knew she'd stolen a gladdy, I'd felt a strange attachment to those gorgeous flowers. Once in the early 60s, I was on stage in a Sydney theatre, holding an audience spellbound as usual. A large vase of flesh-pink glads sat on the piano, and as though in the grip of a mysterious force, I felt myself hurl them into the auditorium, Hands flew up and grabbed them, and the front row of the stalls was soon waving their lovely floral tributes in time to my finale. I still end my shows the same way, and poverty-stricken British florists have been known to buy front-row seats in order to replenish their meagre stocks. But I'm sure the special relationship I have with gladioli, the fact that it is now Australia's national flower, thanks to me, is due entirely to my ghostly ancestor. When the consortium of international publishing tycoons flew into Geneva to sound me out about a warts-and-all autobiography, I realized I would need a bit of help researching my infant years. Who could tell me intimate little things about myself as a bubba? That was the big question, which would take me on a long journey across the VIP lounge of Geneva International Airport. Incidentally, I've never bothered with elitist things like private jets, or even bodyguards and minders, and if any sick, troubled man from a broken home ever tried to make a sexual attack on me, my bridesmaid, Madge Alsop, has promised to throw herself between us. In no time at all, I was soaring high above the Alps, my brow pressed against the chilly plastic porthole, musing to myself, somewhere down there, Edna, in the midst of all those busy little people with their hopes and fears, tears and laughter, joys and disappointments, lies my money. Oh, it was not a disagreeable thought. Here I was, jetting back to Australia, my bridesmaid Madge tucked away about half a mile, 50 crying kiddies, and 5 toilet queues behind me in economy. 24 hours later, my jumbo touched down at Tullamarine, Melbourne's world-class terminal. While Madge waited in the baggage hall, I was whisked past the long queues of boat people to the arrivals lounge, where I peered anxiously around for the person who was going to meet me. There, slumped on a tangerine Draylon sofa, was my Uncle Victor. Gazing down at this little cicada of a man, it was impossible to believe that he had once been called the Butcher of Borneo. "Ed," he cried, "it's little Ed!" As he flung himself into my arms, I felt the brittle old bones of my mother's brother, the war hero, through my humanely culled acrylic Arctic fox. "We've told your mum you're coming, but we can't guarantee she'll recognize you, Ed." I decided to visit my mother's retirement facility as quickly as possible. It was a miracle, after all, that the old darling was still with us, and her periods of lucidity were becoming few and far between. It had been a year or so since I'd visited Melbourne, and peeping through the bulletproof glass of my stretch limo, I saw the old familiar landmarks. I felt my eyes moisten, and there was no time for a nostalgic detour, because I had to get to Dunraven, St. Peter's Close, before blanket bath time. Call me old-fashioned, but I detest small talk. My wonderful old mother used to say, if you can't say anything nice, then don't say anything at all. As a matter of fact, that was one of my mother's many sayings, which we found scribbled in a notebook the night we burned her things. "A stitch in time saves 9, and too many cooks spoil the broth," were also marvellous little philosophical phrases she used to come out with. Smart Alecs have pooh-poohed this, saying they've heard those expressions hundreds of times before. And they have. Let's face it, my mother lavished her wisdom on everyone who crossed her path, and, these days, her ramp. Anyway, it's funny, but I who can natter on so fluently with the likes of George and Barbie Bush, Gore Vidal, and Dr. Jonathan Miller, found it hard to know what to say to my little Uncle Victor. I knew how proud he was of me. Didn't he dine out on my reputation? I use the term dine out rather loosely, Possums, because I rather doubt if the poor old darling has ever eaten in a restaurant in his life. And my little niece Kylie told me they actually never let him out in the daytime for fear he'd bump into a crocodile of Japanese tourists and experience a gruesome knee-jerk reaction. To the home of a friend, the road is never long. Yes, that was another of my mother's wonderful sayings, but I'm here to tell you that the road to my mother's twilight home was the dickens of a long way. The internationally acclaimed lights of Melbourne were becoming few and far between when I realised we were about 70 miles from the city centre and approaching the outer suburbs, named after award-winning Australian sporting and cultural identities. My mother's twilight home lay near the boundaries of Keneally, Goolagong and Minogue. Dunraven was a beautiful old period home built last century in the middle of nowhere by a famous bookie. "Let us cherish your bewildered," said the fully illustrated colour brochure, which showed a tan doctor with silver sideburns extending his hand to a refined and grateful gentlewoman with a Zimmer walking frame, wearing a twin set and her late husband's Omega. There were also artist impressions of cleanly dressed oldsters watching TV and zimmering around in rose gardens, smiling all over their faces like those people you see on the air safety card as they slither down emergency chutes or calmly inflate each other's whistles. As the new prestige homes of Minogue, Keneally and Goolagong pressed closer and closer, the consortium started to sell off bits of the garden. So the old house was soon hemmed in by new developments, and you'd be lucky to get a Zimmer between the fence and the house. But Sister Choate organises the occasional outing for the partially bewildered. Once they all went to the TV studios to visit the set of Prisoner Cell Block H, where they were photographed with some of the stars. Sister Choate told me there was a wee bit of a problem getting her girls back into the bus, since the bars and other security devices on the set reminded them so vividly of Dunraven that they actually thought they were home. At last our conveyance swung into St. Peter's Close, the street in which Dunraven stands. Sister Choate welcomed us in what must have been once a gorgeous Nouveau Deco hallway. She attempted to curtsy, but I nipped that in the bud. I know a lot of people feel like bowing and scraping when they meet me. In fact, I can understand it. But like all Australians, I am non-elitist, and I always like informality to be the keynote. "I think, Dame Edna," said Sister Choate with a little cough, "that we should have a chat before you visit Mother." I followed her uneasily into her office. Then she said gravely, "You'll notice a big change in Mother. She is as strong as an ox, but with respect, I doubt if she's ever going to make a lot of sense, even with the intravenous scopolamine." Frankly, Possums, I was irritated by this woman, who I was paying a fortune to, saying Mother this and Mother that. "I think I'm the best judge of my mother's frame of mind, sister," I heard myself saying rather sharply. "Naturally, I know my mother is no spring chicken, although she's got as many chemicals in her as one. But there are just a few vital questions I have to ask her." Choate pressed a buzzer. "Nurse Nug! Nurse Nug! Dame Edna is here to see Mrs. Beasley in the Sylvia Plath suite." The arrival of an adorable boat person in a crisp white uniform calmed me, and I was led by little Nurse Nug in the direction of the Sylvia Plath suite and the wonderful woman who had brought me into the world. "It's my niceness. I pride myself on my niceness. It's such a gift without price to be nice even when you feel blue, 'cause I really care, and I've come here to share my wonderful, wonderful niceness with you."
And Dame Edna Everage will read the second episode of her shimmering autobiography, My Gorgeous Life, tomorrow.
From time to time I've given part of my increment towards the Dunraven Refurbishment Fund, and they had, in a pathetic attempt to please me, named a ward after me. So I persuaded them to name rooms after other famous female achievers. Hence the Dora Carrington ward, the Virginia Woolf incontinence wing, and the Zelda Fitzgerald fire escape. All women who had done something with their lives. As I entered my mother's suite, I could see that Sister Choate and her cronies had made a hasty attempt to tidy things up for my arrival. Publicity stills of me with Gore Vidal and Klaus von Bülow had been hastily stuck around the cheerless room. I positioned myself between the TV and my beloved Ulster. "Mummy," I began. "Hello, Bruce," she said in a very clear, matter-of-fact voice. "Have you turned off the sprinkler?" "You must remember me, Mummy," I began. "It's Edna, your only daughter." Large tears started to roll down her face. "Oh, Bruce," she moaned, "do you think Edna is really ours? Could there have been some mix-up at Bethesda?" I suddenly felt old and tired. I was getting some answers at last, but not the answers I wanted. I'm not a saint, at least not yet, though I've had a rather flattering tip-off from my little Polish pal. However, Possums, it was pretty saintly of me, let's face it, to drive halfway across Australia in order to see a woman who thought I was someone else. Then Madge Alsop entered the room, and to my irritation, Mummy looked up excitedly. "Edna," she cried, "I knew you'd come and see me again today." Oh, how Alsop relished her new role. "After all, Edna," said Madge, "I visit her far more often than you do. She's probably just transferred her affections." That kind of remark was typical of Madge. Oh, it was true that she might have popped out to see Mummy a little more often than me. But then, did she have to entertain millions on stage, screen and television? And radio? Did she have to sit up half the night, taking distress calls from the Queen, Mrs. Thatcher and Elizabeth Taylor, to name but three? People who feel sorry for my old bridesmaid and travelling companion are barking up the wrong tree, very much so. She is as cunning as a fox, and I know for a fact that she has had her eye on my mother's matinee jacket collection for years. For now, I decided to ignore her. "Mummy, do you remember when I was born?" I whispered, hoping Madge was ready to take this down. She had once failed miserably at the Margaret Hosegood Academy for Secretarial Studies, Auckland, New Zealand. Mummy's little face contorted. "We can't call her Edna, Bruce, just to please your mother," she cried. "But shh, I think she's trying to say something. It sounds like—" "What was I trying to say, Mummy?" I exhorted her. Suddenly my mother's eyes became dilated as she articulated something that sounded like Mossop Olla. "Write it down, woman," I screamed at Madge. "They were probably my first words. It must mean something. Could it be some foreign tongue? Shirley had often told me that reincarnated people talked a lot of rubbish most of the time, and even got it published. But the other day I was given a doctorate of culture at the University of Madrid. I told a clever old professor called Dr. Federico Mompu this story, and with a secret smile he said, "Try saying it backwards, Signora." For the spookiest experience of a lifetime, I suggest my listeners do likewise. Mossop Olla. "Hello, Possum!" Oh. At that moment my mother sat bolt upright. "The hair, Bruce, the hair," she bawled. "Look at her hair, it's mauve. Where did we go wrong?" My mother's brutal words sent my mind scurrying down memory lane. My earliest memories are of the old township of Wagga Wagga. But our days at Wagga Wagga were numbered. My parents, Bruce and Gladys Beasley, hankered for Melbourne, Australia's most refined capital. And soon we moved into our new home in the Big Smoke at 36 Humoresque Street, Moonee Ponds. In my wonderful stage shows, I often ask women in the audience to describe their homes to me, and some of them find it a bit difficult. A lady once confessed that being in my company made the rest of her life seem like a dream, as though I was the only reality, and she really had to rack her brains to remember where she lived and who she was married to. Compliments like that don't grow on trees, do they, possums? Now the boot is on the other foot, and I am trying to describe to you the home in which I spent my childhood, and frankly, it isn't easy. I'm sorry, but it isn't. Up to now, I've forgotten to mention my 3 brothers, Roy, Athol, and Laurie. A lot of folk pick me for an only child, and let's face it, I certainly am a bit of a one-off. But I've never made a big publicity thing about my wonderful brothers out of unselfishness. The fact that they have a megastar sister should never be allowed to interfere with their simple, low-profile lives. Poor little Athol, my younger brother, by about 9 years. The last 10 years of his life have been a nightmare. Once the neighbours found out that he was my brother, every Tom, Dick and Harry pestered him and his pathetic little wife, Dawn, née Purdy, for my autograph. Oh, Athol doesn't earn much as a Venetian blind repair operative. Between you and me and the privacy of this little broadcast, I paid for his house and every stick of furniture in it. But to his credit, little Athol has refused squillions from Rupert Murdoch and his ilk for his story. A Sunday rag recently ran a story, My Sister, Dame Edna, and they even published smudgy snaps taken from a satellite of me visiting Athol's home in my limo. Athol swore he never told them anything, but his wife Dawn, who I have never liked, nothing to do with Catholicism, piped up with some tale of woe about the cost of a swimming pool in the backyard and how some gutter publication had offered to install one. In a weak moment I took the hint, and in a short space of time a 10-metre, fully tiled, free-form swimming pool with an inbuilt spa and travertine surrounds was installed. But Dawn has overplayed her hand, if only she knew it, and she'll get nothing more from me. Young and impressionable as I was in Moonee Ponds, I began to get the feeling that I may have been adopted, because I felt, so different from my own family, a bit of an outsider, if you like. I've since read biographies of Mozart, Shakespeare, Vlad the Impaler, and Mrs. Thatcher, and discovered to my relief that they all entertained the same scary fantasy. Expressed bluntly, it was, how can a brilliant and gorgeous person like me have been born to a stupid, boring old couple like you? It sounds awful, doesn't it, listeners? But that's how I felt, and if this little broadcast isn't honest, it's nothing. Soon after we settled in, my father began a new job, travelling from door to door, purveying vacuum cleaners, and as a special treat he'd sometimes take me on his local house calls. He thought I was his lucky mascot, because I always made such a big impression on the clients. But one day, as the front door closed behind us, I distinctly heard a woman say to her daughter, "Wasn't that kid a real little madam?" Oh, those cruel words stung my sensitive nature deeply, and I can't say I was sorry to hear the news a couple of months later that that woman's house was burnt down, leaving them destitute. Shouldn't laugh. In my experience, people always get their comeuppance sooner or later, don't they, possums? A Sydney critic once accused me, one of the most left-wing radical women on the planet, of being a fascist and a racist. Oh, I could have sued him for squillions or told Rupert or Kerry to give him the sack. But instead I kept my dignity and said nothing. A few weeks later, his rock opera flopped, his newspaper folded, and his wife got bitten by a funnel-web spider. Why should I ever need the expensive services of my solicitors, Fenimore and Girder, when Dame Nature sorts out very nicely, in her own sweet time, all those who are foolish enough to let their jealousy get the better of them? But all this was very far from my mind as Madge and I sat silently in the back of the limo on the long journey to central Melbourne. The dawn sky was anemia green when, dead on our feet, we tottered into our luxury hotel suite. The next day I was a write-off. I had to drag myself to Melbourne's internationally acclaimed, award-winning arts complex for a rehearsal of Brecht Weill ditties with the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra, conducted by my old chum Sir Charlie Mackerras. On top of everything, a telex from my publisher reminded me in an uncalled-for way about the deadline for this story, and I realised that, weary as I was, I should have to continue my intensive research into those early years, the childhood that shaped a legend. "Where are we off to now, Edna?" squeaked Madge as the limo swept us away from rehearsal. "Back to Moonee Ponds," I declared dramatically. Thanks entirely to me, the suburb of Moonee Ponds is world famous. Our conveyance swung into Humoresque Street, where already I could see the gleaming coaches banked up in the street outside my modest old dwelling. Then snuck unobtrusively down a side street in the direction of Moonee Ponds Girls' Grammar. Have any of my listeners, I wonder, ever revisited their old school after many years? It's always spooky how little everything looks, isn't it? The vast and dusty playground where bullies once held sway, and the shelter shed behind which fast girls from broken homes smoked and played nurses or even doctors, all looked almost miniature. It was in the shadowy recesses of the shelter shed that I first met Marjorie Kirry McWhirter. I was captain of my year, and my chums, Val Dunn and Anne Forbes, introduced me. "This is the new girl from New Zealand, Edna," they said. "She's hopeless at hockey, and her nose has been bleeding all morning." There are moments, momentous moments in all our lives. We open a door instead of closing it. We say no instead of yes. We turn right instead of left. Beware of pity, listeners, because it was pity which caused me to do a very odd thing on that fateful morning in the playground. I opened the door of compassion when I should have slammed it shut on Madge McWhirter's fingers. "This kid isn't well enough for the initiation ceremony today, girls," I ordained. "I'll take her under my wing." It was the biggest mistake of my life.
Dame Edna Everage, housewife megastar, was reading the second of 9 episodes from her book, My Gorgeous Life.
Our school didn't have a matron like they do in traditional school stories, but Miss Godkin was good at first aid, and Madge McWhirter was soon lying wanly on a couch in the sick bay. Miss Godkin took me aside and whispered something which people have been telling me pretty well non-stop ever since. "Thank you, Beasley," she said. "Do you only think of others, never of yourself?" Oh, what could I say? "Keep an eye on this girl," confided the kind teacher. "She's an orphan with serious learning and coordination disorders, the runt of the litter, if you like," and Stella Godkin's voice dropped to an almost inaudible hiss. "She's a New Zealander." The above snippets of information were about all I was ever able to learn about my future bridesmaid's background. Madge never spoke of her early years, not even in her sleep, when, for a taciturn woman of Presbyterian origin, she did most of her talking. Although I don't know it for certain, there is every possibility Madge Alsop, her married name, is as rich as Croesus, with money tied up in butter and kiwi fruit, or whatever New Zealanders tie their money up in. My psychic powers are never wrong, and I guess it was instinct that drew me to the ugly duckling of Moonee Ponds Girls' Grammar. The ugly duckling who would never turn into a swan, To be accurate, Madge was really an ugly Kiwi, making the odds even longer. Listeners will recall that at the time of this historic meeting, I had become captain of my year. On the surface, confident, brilliant at my studies, without peer in sport, and already the star of the debating and dramatic societies. I edited the school magazine, Tempus Fugit, and there was something about my exceptional looks and personality which drew people to me, staff and students alike. Typically, I showed Madge McWhirter a little of the kindness and concern which I had really received as a new girl. You see, I knew she would never survive the initiation ceremony. It was phase 3 that worried me, since I doubted very much if Madge could swim. And although even then she was the most unimaginative person I'd ever met, I feared a night alone in the cemetery could unhinge a temperament already far from stable. But before you start feeling sorry for her, remember Madge was and still is a very artful and calculating person who loves nothing better than the limelight, even if it takes the form of ridicule. My shrink, Dr. Sidney Schadenfreude, whom I see for my children's sake, not mine, said Madge was a typical compulsive attention seeker. However, as a schoolgirl, she was less forward and pushy than she is now, and it was almost touching the way she made herself useful to me. But when I saw All About Eve at the Mooney Cinema years later, when my son Kenny and his flatmate Clifford Smale organised Australia's first Betty Davis Festival, I found myself riveted by little Anne Baxter's performance as the timid lass who comes to pay homage and then turns into a copycat and a backstabber. I watched all her manoeuvres with a sense of mounting horror. I was Betty Davis, and Madge was the scheming minx waiting for her moment of glory. I was so upset I couldn't concentrate afterwards on Cliff's lecture on the early films of Susan Hayward and Yvonne de Carlo. Because Madge's parents were dead, or so the story went, she spent her school days living with distant relations in the nearby suburb of Pascoe Vale. She never let any of us so much as glimpse her down-market accommodation, but my mother had a strong suspicion it was semi-detached. Only once or twice did we ever see her auntie, Mrs. Finley, when she appeared at speech days wearing every colour of the rainbow. I remember at the time wondering in a nice way if there'd been a power strike at Pascoe Vale. She looked as though she'd dressed in the dark. Incidentally, note that I was making perceptive yet caring observations about people, even then as a teenager. Now there was a war on, and we had a soggy old air raid shelter in the backyard to prove it. Mostly it was full of water, khaki water appropriately enough, so I couldn't help feeling that if the Japs did bomb Mooney, we were, well, less likely to be blown up than to drown as we scuttled to safety. Once, when the American fleet was in, we had a U.S. naval officer to Sunday dinner. It was funny to hear a real person speaking like they did at the pictures, and I think we were all too awestruck to exchange more than a few words with him. Like all Americans then and now, he seemed very nice, polite, and impenetrably foreign, as though he'd come from Mars. Don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are American, but any country that can call a movie Every Which Way But Loose has to be a bit alien. Then the war was over, and I was preparing for my first big dance. My mother knelt in front of me, putting the final touches to my very first party frock, a full-length lime and apricot floral crepe de chine, with a soft crossover bodice, a slight cowl, and a beaded snood. As if to remind me how fortunate I was, The doorbell rang, and I heard my brother Roy calling, "It's Madge McWhirter. Want to see her, Ed?" Before I could say the 40s equivalent of, "Do me a favour, no way, you must be joking," a pathetic figure appeared in the doorway in a fawn and brown net creation. "My date hasn't turned up yet," whined Madge. "Can I come with you, Edna?" "Your date will never turn up, Madge," I replied, with a pragmatism that most people would have found helpful and caring. "And where the dickens did you find that frock?" "It was my mother's," said the orphan. "It is by a top New Zealand couturier." "That's obvious," said I. Even in those far-off days, listeners, I was interested in clothes. No surprise my younger son Kenneth is now a household name in the world of high fashion. Funny, too, that as I gaze down at the ladies in my audience when I'm doing one of my wonderful shows, I can't help making constructive comments about their frocks. Not that I ever get a word of thanks for my pains. Name another show in the history of world theatre which goes out of its way to boost the morale of its frumpily dressed female patrons. That night of my first dance, my mother came to the rescue. "I'm sorry, Madge," she said. "Edna's date will be here at any moment, and if you need a lift to the dance tonight, you'll have to ask him, though I tend to suspect two's company and three's a crowd." That was yet another of my mother's sayings, which has since caught on like wildfire. I wasn't sure about my date. I'd only met him briefly at Anne Forbes' place. He was a burly Sydney boy in Melbourne for a holiday at his uncle's, and there was something a bit ordinary about him, which wasn't just the Sydney background. Anne said she'd seen him smoking, and he smelt of the odd sherry. She said that he had also said something rather worrying, to the effect that he wasn't much of a churchgoer. But what did I care? When that slightly common voice on the phone said, "It's Les, remember me? Want to come to the big hop at the town hall next Saturday?" I heard myself say yes. What if my partner was a bit older than the other boys? He'd promised to pick me up in a car, probably his uncle's, but a car all the same. The doorbell rang again, and Les was soon standing in our lounge, holding out a gardenia in a celluloid box, with the price, 4 and 9, still on it. "Thought you might like this to stick on your dress, Ed," he said rather awkwardly. "Mind if I use the lav?" He was certainly a lot older than I thought, with ash already sprinkled down the front of his slightly greasy dinner jacket. My idol in those days was Van Johnson, and my eyes were already prickling with tears as I compared him with the snaggle-toothed youth I now introduced to my parents. "Daddy, I'd like you to meet Les Patterson from Sydney," I added by way of explanation. "Pleased to meet you, son," my father said. "I'll take you out the back and show you where it is." After they left the room, I couldn't bring myself to look at Madge. I wasn't going to let her see how bitterly disappointed I was in the ill-mannered type who was to squire me to the ball. When Les came back, he beamed around the room. "Time to be going, Ed," he said. "How's about your little girlfriend, Madge? Could she use a lift?" Moonee Ponds Town Hall looked lovely that night. Balloons, paper streamers, and decorations festooned the ceiling. But my heart sank as I spied Leslie weaving his way towards me, clutching a glass of fruit cup and a large lager. My mother had always warned me about accepting refreshment from strange men, and Les was getting stranger by the minute. There was a well-known ladies' powder room in the heart of Melbourne's shopping centre, from which some girls had never emerged after accepting beverages from strangers. They had later reappeared in Hamburg, Beirut and Cairo, doing the sort of thing that only air hostesses would consider today. Les dragged me to the dance floor, still with a moustache of froth on his upper lip. No single experience of pain or anguish in my life ever seemed to last as long. Not even my son Kenny's difficult birth, or the time I nearly poisoned Prince Charles. When at last the music stopped, I fled to the ladies' powder room. Would I go home now, I wondered, or see it through to the bitter end? But a little voice inside me said, "You're meant to be here tonight, Edna. Tonight is spookily special." I also thought I could hear the voice of Lionel Barrymore uttering his famous phrase, "Courage, Camille." And sure enough, as I emerged from the powder room, someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned and saw a slightly built young man with alert, slightly prominent ears. We stood facing each other for a moment in silence. Then he swept me onto the pulsating dance floor. "My name's Edna," I told my partner. "What's yours?" "Norman," he said huskily. "My friends call me Norm." And before the next dance had begun, he'd asked me to the pictures on the following Friday. As for Les Patterson, I never saw him again until many, many years later, though I did hear on the grapevine that he had become a successful Australian politician, not, as the world knows, a profession demanding high standards of honour, etiquette, or personal cleanliness. And some weeks later, Daddy went off on the trip of a lifetime. Some of his cobbers at the Returned Servicemen's League had organised a back-to-the-trenches excursion to the old battlefields in France and the Middle East, where they had served their homeland in the First World War. Daddy sent back wonderful postcards of overseas nooks and crannies and third world views. "I hope it helps him get it out of his system at last," my mother said, with an air of a woman who's heard the same story once too often. In my last year at Mooney Ponds Girls' Grammar, I helped organise the school play. Our drama teacher, Miss Moira Jago, chose Macbeth, one of Shakespeare's gorgeous shows, and no prizes for guessing who topped the audition for the leading lady. I thought a lot about my character and decided that Lady Macbeth was, when all is said and done, just an ordinary Scottish housewife trying to cope with her husband's midlife crisis, and I'm told this is how it came across the footlights. Yet when the applause had died and the bouquets had wilted, I realised that in only a few short months my school days would be over and I would have to find myself a vocation. I considered becoming a model, but I would have to change my name to something more glamorous. Bambi Beasley appealed, because I'd once been described as doe-eyed, but there was already another Melbourne beauty of that name, so I tried to think of other Disney characters. Yet somehow Dumbo Beasley or even Pinocchio didn't quite hit the spot. I suppose I was waiting for Dame Nature to give me a sign, and she did. I came home from school one Tuesday, and the phone was ringing. "Yes," I said, when a crackly voice asked me if this was the Beasley home. The crackly voice said it was the Australian consulate in Paris. "I'm sorry," the voice continued. "We deeply regret that Bruce Clive Beasley met with an accident in the Somme Valley yesterday. He died almost immediately." A cable, then a letter, confirmed that ghastly phone call, with the information that Daddy had tripped on a grassy mound while trying to take a snapshot of his old battlefield. If I had been worried about the future a few months before, it was all settled now. Someone had to hold the fort, and that someone wouldn't have time for university or finishing school or modelling. I knew that what I would be going on to would be the kitchen sink. Several years passed like a kind of dream, cooking and cleaning the house. I was not unhappy because I knew Dame Nature still had something up her sleeve. Meanwhile, Norman, Stoddart, Everage and I announced our engagement. Mummy, who was passing through a period of apparent lucidity, gave us her blessing. "You could do a lot worse, Edna," she declared, looking at a snap of Daddy in uniform on the mantelpiece and sighing deeply. "Just one little question. Where are you two planning to live? You could always stay here for the first few months. But I suppose your ladyship wants to live on the other side of the river." I felt awful because, in one way, I did have dreams of a mansion in Melbourne's most upmarket suburb, Toorak, an old Aboriginal word meaning upmarket suburb. It's not a very difficult language. "Oh, Mummy," I exclaimed, "we couldn't." "What's wrong with this house?" she retorted angrily. "It was good enough for us." "Look," I assented, "we'd love to. But promise to say something, Mummy, if we ever get in the way." By then I had wedding fever, and I must have been in a particularly good mood, because one morning I found myself ringing up Madge McWhirter. "I'd like you to be one of my bridesmaids," I heard myself saying. Holy Trinity, Moonee Ponds, was packed that day. And since Norman was an ex-serviceman, Cannon Lake had suggested that Mrs. Tribe, the organist, could play the Marine's hymn from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Norm hadn't been anywhere, it said in the song, but Cannon Lake had brushed that aside. Soon Mrs. Tribe's version of the Mendelssohn Wedding March shuddered through the church. The wedding photos are all at the Dame Edna Everage archive at the University of Southwest Virginia. Then we rumbled off to the Moonee Ponds Town Hall for the reception. After the reception, we spent the wedding night at the Windsor Hotel before honeymooning in Tasmania. Norm, still fully dressed, spent rather a lot of time poring over the map of Tasmania. So I slipped into the bathroom to apply my night cream and prepare myself for whatever Dame Nature had in store for me. I know that a certain element of my listeners, a small one I trust, is expecting to hear lurid and permissive details about my wedding night, but this is not that kind of broadcast. I'm sorry, but it isn't. Call me old-fashioned, but I have never discussed my honeymoon horror stories with other women, and I don't expect them to share theirs with me. I'm sorry, but I don't. Back in Moonee Ponds, life passed very happily. My brothers were no trouble, and Norman was an angel. It's funny to revisit my old kitchen these days and see a little rope fence in front of my fridge and a sign on it in Japanese saying, "Do not touch, postcards available at desk." I forgot to say that Madge McWhirter had gone back to New Zealand to stay with her mother's half-sister. Very pregnant, I remember waddling down to Port Melbourne to see her off. And I was naturally very sweet and affectionate to her, since I never expected to see Madge again. She told me she was still having physio on her neck, where my wedding bouquet had dealt her a glancing blow, wiping out an entire nerve centre. I tried to explain that it was lucky all the same, no matter what part of the body you caught it with, but poor old Madge looked none too hopeful as we parted. She whispered tearfully, "You're my only true friend, Edna. Something tells me we'll be very close one day." Subsequent events have proved her horribly right. Trevor, after Trevor Howard, Bruce, after my father Everage, was born at 6:30 in the morning of a lovely spring day in September. Brucey thrived, and I was glad we were starting our family early. With Norman so much older, I was keen to have youngsters while he was still, well, comparatively mobile. It was not long before toddler Brucey had a wee sister, Valmay Shirley. Her little curly topknot and adorable smile was spookily reminiscent of the famous child star. But later, Valmay's hair straightened out, and I'm sad to say a smile hasn't crossed her lips in years. Certainly not in my presence. But that's another story of gross ingratitude you will be dumbfounded to hear. She won't thank me for mentioning it in this fearless broadcast, I'll be bound. And I doubt if she will much enjoy her friends hearing it either, at the Trotskyist woman's agitprop guerrilla puppet workshop. I spoilt Valmay and never smacked her. Spare the rod and spoil the child was another of my mother's more lucid sayings, and perhaps if I had given Valmay the occasional pat when she was naughty, I might still have a daughter I could be proud of. Meanwhile, our family was growing, and so was I, for I was expecting my third and last infant, the world-famous couturier, Kenneth Montgomery Everage. I felt a very happy woman, complete and at peace. Yet, as always, when things seemed perfect, there was deep in the core of me that little niggling shadow I could not yet put a name to. I still kept in touch with some of my old girlfriends, and imagine my pleasure and embarrassment when I learned that they had entered me in a competition without my knowing it. It was Australia's internationally acclaimed, award-winning Lovely Mother Quest. Under pressure from my girlfriends, I'd sent in the latest family photo, and imagine our excitement when it appeared one morning on the front page of the Morning Murdoch with the headline, Moony Mum in bid for title. The prize was a trip to London for two, all expenses paid, a wardrobe of frocks from the House of Delphine, and 100 guineas spending money. I filled in the questionnaire and forgot all about it. I'm sorry, but I did. Though the yellowed cutting from the Murdoch is still glued on the back of the old kitchen door in the Dame Edna Museum. Multilingual postcards available at desk. It was a few weeks later, and one of those hot, sultry nights we used to get before the hole in the ozone layer changed everything. As I lay there unable to sleep, I heard in the distance the iron rumble of an all-night tram. Occasionally a car passed down Humoresque Street. I must have dozed off, for I was back at school showing the other girls a toy I had, when a tall boy in a powder blue tracksuit appeared out of nowhere, smiling at me. I tried to give him my toy as a present, but he kept shaking his head. Please, please, I said, take it. But no words came. My mouth just opened and closed dryly. Then the school bell rang. Not long ago, I told this spooky dream to Dr. Sidney Schadenfreude, whom I see for my children, and I asked him point blank what it meant. His reply was typical, I'm afraid, and made me wonder, quite frankly, why I keep pumping money into his practice. He looked over at me on the couch and said, "What do you think it means, Dame Edna?" The school bell was still ringing. Then I woke up. The phone was ringing in our lounge. Ringing in the way phones do that have been ringing for quite a while and are about to stop. I jumped out of bed into our sitting room and, plucking up the black vulcanite receiver of our Coronation model phone, said, "This is Edna Everage." "Kevin Farrelly of the Morning Murdoch here," said the phone. "What time is it?" I yawned, squinting at my lovely Drummond's Art Deco chiming 8-day in figured walnut with a chrome bezel. "Sorry, Edna," said the phone. "It's 2 a.m, but we need your comments and a photo." "I'm sorry, Mr. What's-her-name," I said. "I'm half asleep. What do you want exactly?" "You've won the Lovely Mother Quest," came the voice. "So hop into your glad rags so we can get a nice picky for the front page." For a minute or two I sat in the darkness, making sure I wasn't dreaming. Then the front doorbell chimed loudly. "Coming," I bawled through the rippled glass of our front door. As I opened the door, there was a burst of flashlight. "Kevin Farrelly," said an ambitious-looking young chap in a crumpled suit. "How's it feel to scoop up the big prize when you're just an ordinary Melbourne housewife living in a suburban house where nothing exciting has ever happened?"
It's my nice one. I pride myself on my nice one. It's such a gift without price to be nice even